In this movie, we'll look at setting user preferences in Pro Tools. There's two ways to get to this page. First is in the Pro Tools menu. Second thing down is Preferences. The other way is in the Setup menu. The last item on the bottom is Preferences. There are 8 tabs across the top, and let's start with Display. Now, I'm not going to cover every choice on every one of these menus, but let's hit the high points. Tooltips. These are the little yellow pop-ups that are helpful when you're learning Pro Tools. At some point, you'll know what the tools do, and you can turn this off. Edit window default length. If you work in commercials, you could set your default length for 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Or if you work in pop music and your average song is 4 minutes, then you could set that. So this code value is hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. Organize plugin menus by. But we have to get out of this window to see it. So let's cancel out of here. Let's go to Audio Suite. And the plugins are grouped by category. The EQs are together, the dynamics are together, the pitch shifts are together, and so on. Now let's go back to Setup and Preferences and change this to a flat list. And we'll say OK. Then we go to Audio Suite and we get a very different looking list than we had before. So it's just like they said, they're an alphabetical list without reference to what they do. All right, we'll go back to Setup and Preferences. And the other choices are alternate ways to group your plugins. I'm going to change mine back to category, and when I say OK, when I leave this page, it will save those for me. At the bottom here is the Show Quick Start when Pro Tools starts. We have that option in the Quick Start menu itself, and here it is again. On the right side of this menu is the MIDI note color. I think they borrowed that from an Apple program, and it's great when you're editing MIDI and you can see the velocities by color. And the rest of this page lets you set colors for tracks and regions in Pro Tools, and you can set the preferences you like for that. Let's move to Operation. We can reach up and click, or we can Command and right arrow our way to the next tab. So I like the default settings for this page. Seems to me you'd always want the Play Start marker to follow your timeline selection. You can control the speed of fast forward and rewind and even hear audio if you like. One of the big advantages of nonlinear editing is you don't have to rewind anymore, so in terms of efficiency, I don't think it's much help. But I've used fast forward and rewind to get some interesting effects that I recorded onto a second system and then I brought back into Pro Tools. And we talked about saving in the last movie, and if you're not a saver, then Pro Tools has your back and it will auto backup for you. It will keep 999 of your most recent backups for you, not 1,000. If I type 1000, too many characters. 999 is all you get. And it will back up every minute, but not less than a minute. If I type 0.5 in here, it just reverts it to 5. But lots of backups. User library, that's new to 11. You don't log into Pro Tools, like some apps, but you do log into the computer that's running it. So this lets you customize the location of your documents and plugin settings and templates. This stuff. Okay, I'll cancel out of that. We use playlists for alternate takes, so I would activate automatically create new playlists when loop recording. We'll see that in action later on. And we'll leave these as defaults and go on to editing. Command and right arrow. The handiest thing on this page is the levels of undo down here at the bottom. Your max is 64. That's up from 32 in previous releases. And on the left here in the middle, you can set new tracks to default to a tick time base, which would be something you do if you're doing all or almost all MIDI, and you don't want to deal with sample-based time bases. Some options for setting your fades here. We'll explore fades later on. Some options for setting your zooms. We'll look at those later on as well. And then off to mixing. Your default EQ. Let's say that you really fall in love with one of these EQs, let's say the 7-band. And let's say you fall in love with one of these dynamics, let's say the 76, right at the top. Then when you say OK, and you jump to the mix window, and you have a track, Shift-Command-N, and you insert a plugin, you'll see that those have now jumped out of the list here. They're still in the list. Because they're your favorites, they're sitting right here on top where you can get to them easily. So that's kind of handy. I'll go back to Setup and Preferences and turn these off. Say OK. and now they've jumped back into the list where they were before. Back to Setup and Preferences. We'll cover Touch and Latch when we talk about automation. For now, we'll leave it on Latch, and we'll switch to Metering. This is a new tab in Pro Tools 11. So first we get to choose whether to have the same or different types of meters in our track metering and our master metering. If this is unchecked, we have choices for each. If I check this, they become the same. I'll leave it unchecked. Now we skip over here to the right, and you can determine where the color break is on the meters themselves. In other words, from green to yellow to red. On the lower left, I like these settings of a peak hold for 3 seconds and clip indication infinite. This one I think is more important than that one. And the reason is, if I looked away and I missed the event that caused the clipping, I want Pro Tools to tell me and show me a red box that I have to click on to make it go away and acknowledge the clipping. All right, let's jump to processing. I would recommend turning on the broadcast wave option and the copy files option. If you work with a sound effect from another session, the Wilhelm scream, for instance, you could just add it to your session without making a copy. But then it's not in the audio files folder for your session. It's wherever you found it, and it's staying there, and Pro Tools will have to go there and find it anytime you want to play it. So I think it's always a good habit to keep the files that are in your session folder. Okay, we saw this when we imported our clock, that we had 5 choices of sample rate conversion. I guess this could be called the platinum choice, and there was a time probably when you wanted this to be fast and you were willing to give up quality, and I think those days are probably gone. Computers are so fast now that I think you can have quality and speed. On the right side, you can choose your default time compression plugin. This is the one that will get used when you use the TCE trimmer. We'll look at that later. Now you can dig deeper and choose the default setting and choose the algorithm that the TCE trimmer will use. And then in post-production, we do a lot of things that involve resolution, resolving speeds, and so forth. So from film to NTSC to NTSC, or maybe to PAL. So you have lots of choices for the various pull-ups and pull-downs that you might need to do in post. Down to Elastic. You can choose the default algorithm for Elastic audio. So we'll talk about these choices more in a later chapter. Elastic is turned off new tracks by default, and this box lets you enable it on every single track all the time. But I think the efficient workflow is probably to enable it when you really use it. Okay, on to MIDI. The second thing down here is use MIDI to tap tempo. I'm going to turn this on now, and we'll work with it later when we're editing library music. Wait for note. F11 key. That's handy when you're psyching yourself up to play a part. It'll sit in mark time until you're ready to go. If you want Pro Tools to automatically give you a click track in your session, you do that here. Some of you will be doing announcing and you'll never want a click track. Some of you are doing music and you'll want it all the time, so that's why we have a choice. The default through instrument, I would choose the first selected MIDI track. If you're not routing your MIDI to something, then it's hard to know when it's hooked up properly. For double clicking, I like the MIDI editor. The option is that you can go to the name dialog so you can name the clip, or to the event list. We'll leave this for MIDI editor and we'll look at some options for that later on. On to synchronization, last tab. Really nothing to change here. You use this if you use Pro Tools to sync to an external machine like a tape machine. Most of the time, Pro Tools will be the master, and the devices, like automation on a mixing board, will slave to Pro Tools. So that's a look at user preferences. Meters is a big one, backups is a big one, undo is a big one, default EQ and dynamics are nice, copy files and sample rate are big ones, and MIDI editor is a good one. So one more thing about preferences. When Pro Tools misbehaves, you can sometimes fix things by trashing your Pro Tools preferences. If I cancel out of here, and I go to the Finder, let me jump to the Finder real fast, and in the Go menu, I don't see my user library. I don't see it until I hold down the Option key, and then it appears. So let me go to that library, and in that library is Preferences. And because I've been changing preferences here lately, I see them kind of close to the top on the date modified. Now, if I scroll down here, I think I see the Pro Tools prefs. They have their own icon. And then you also see something called COM Avid Pro Tools plist. So if Pro Tools misbehaves on a Mac, I would begin by trashing this file, the plist. And if that didn't solve your problem, I would go down and trash the Pro Tools prefs file, the one with its own icon. Back to Pro Tools, back to the edit window. And there are other preferences that aren't on these pages. And next up is window layouts and scrolling options.